The screaming started at 6:45 in the morning, exactly 15 minutes after I fired up my snow machine in the driveway of my house in Eagle River, Alaska. I was minding my own business, warming up my Arctic cat before heading out to the trails for some early morning riding, when Brenda Patterson came storming across the snow-covered street in her pink bathrobe and fuzzy slippers, her face the color of a ripe tomato. She was the president of the Glacier Ridge Homeowners Association, and from the look on her face, I was about to get an earful. "Yates Olson, you turn that thing off right now," she shrieked over the rumble of my machine. It is 6:45 in the morning, and the noise ordinance clearly states no loud machinery before 7 on weekdays. I killed the engine and pulled off my helmet, taking a deep breath of the crisp January air. "Brenda, it's 15 minutes. I'm just warming it up before I head out." 15 minutes or not, it's a violation," she snapped, clutching a leather-bound notebook that I recognized as the HOA rule book. The thing had to be at least 2 inches thick, filled with every ridiculous regulation she and her board had dreamed up over the past 5 years. "And this isn't the first time. You've been warned twice already this winter." That was true. The first time had been back in November when I'd gotten home from work at 5:30 and wanted to squeeze in an hour of riding before dark. Apparently, 5:30 was during quiet hours, according to some new rule they'd passed. The second warning came in December when I'd helped my neighbor Dan clear his driveway with my machine after a massive snowstorm. Good deed, road to hell, all that. "Brenda, I work a regular job. I have to ride either early morning or evening. Those are the only times I have." "Then perhaps you should find a quieter hobby," she said, her thin lips pressed into a line so tight they practically disappeared. "Or move somewhere without an HOA that cares about the quality of life for its residents." I bit back about 10 different responses, none of them polite. "Are you seriously going to fine me for 15 minutes? The rules apply to everyone equally, Yates. You'll be receiving a formal notice in the mail. That's your third violation, which means it's a $500 fine." She turned on her fuzzy heel and marched back toward her house, leaving footprints in the pristine snow. $500. For warming up my snow machine 15 minutes early. I stood there in my driveway, watching her disappear into her oversized house at the end of the cul-de-sac, and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about the noise anymore. This was about Brenda Patterson and her little kingdom of petty tyranny, and I was done being a subject. The fine arrived 3 days later, just as promised. It came in an official-looking envelope with the Glacier Ridge HOA logo, complete with a breakdown of the violation, the specific bylaw I'd broken, and instructions for payment. I sat at my kitchen table, reading through the document while my coffee went cold, and that's when I noticed something interesting in the fine print. The HOA operated out of a clubhouse on the edge of our development. It was a nice building, maybe 3,000 square feet, with a meeting hall, a small gym, and an office where Brenda held court like some kind of suburban monarch. I'd been there exactly once, for a mandatory newcomer meeting when I'd bought my house 3 years ago. What I'd forgotten until I saw it mentioned in the fine was that the clubhouse wasn't actually owned by the HOA. It was owned by a private company called Northern Property Holdings, LLC, and the HOA leased it on a year-to-year basis. I pulled out my laptop and started digging. Northern Property Holdings was registered in Alaska, and after about an hour of searching through public records, I found out that it was a small outfit owned by a guy named Martin Kershaw, who had to be pushing 70 based on the dates I was seeing. More importantly, I found a phone number. Martin answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly and tired. "Kershaw speaking." Mr. Kershaw, my name is Yates Olson. I'm a resident of Glacier Ridge, and I understand you own the clubhouse building that our HOA leases from you. There was a pause. That's right. What's this about? I'm interested in potentially purchasing the property if you'd be willing to sell. Another pause, longer this time. You looking to cause trouble with your HOA, son? I couldn't help but laugh. Is it that obvious? I've owned that building for 12 years. I know exactly what kind of people run that association. Bunch of busybodies with nothing better to do than make other people miserable. He coughed, a wet rattling sound. Tell you what, I'm in Anchorage. Meet me at the Moose's Tooth tomorrow at noon and we'll talk. The Moose's Tooth pizza was packed when I arrived the next day, but I spotted Martin right away. He was sitting in a corner booth, a tall guy with a shock of white hair and hands that looked like they'd done real work at some point in his life. We shook, and I slid into the booth across from him. Appreciate you meeting with me, I said. Figured I owed it to you to at least hear you out. Besides, I've been thinking about selling that place anyway. I'm getting too old to deal with property management, even something as simple as a single building. He signaled the waitress for 2 beers. So tell me why you want it. I told him everything. The fines, the ridiculous rules, Brenda Patterson and her crusade against anything that might disturb her precious peace and quiet. By the time I finished, Martin was grinning. $500 for warming up a snow machine 15 minutes early. That's rich. He took a long pull from his beer. All right, here's the situation. The building's worth about $400,000, give or take. The HOA pays me $3,000 a month in lease payments, which is below market rate, but I gave them a deal because they signed a long-term agreement. That agreement expires at the end of February. So, in 2 months. Exactly. Now, I'm not going to gouge you just because you're motivated. You seem like a decent guy, and I like the idea of sticking it to those petty tyrants. I'll sell you the building for $375,000. That's below market, but I want a quick, clean sale. Cash, no financing contingencies, close in 30 days. I did the math in my head. I had about $100,000 in savings, another $50,000 in investments I could liquidate quickly. I'd need to take out a mortgage for the rest, but with my job as a petroleum engineer, the bank wouldn't blink at approving me. I can do that. Then we have a deal. He stuck out his hand and we shook again. I'll have my lawyer draw up the paperwork. And son, when you do whatever you're planning to do, make sure you document everything. People like that HOA board, they'll try to weasel out of things any way they can. The next 4 weeks were a blur of paperwork, bank meetings, and inspections. I kept my mouth shut about the whole thing, paying my $500 fine without complaint and keeping my snow machine riding to the approved hours. I didn't want to tip off Brenda or anyone else on the HOA board about what was coming. The property inspection revealed that the building was in decent shape, though the roof would need replacing in the next 5 years, and the HVAC system was older than I would have liked. None of it was a deal breaker. My mortgage got approved without any issues, and by the 3rd week of February, I was signing the closing documents in a lawyer's office in Anchorage. Martin shook my hand one last time as we left the office. It's all yours now. The HOA's lease expires on February 28th, which is next Friday. You're not obligated to renew it. I'm aware, I said, unable to keep the smile off my face. Give them hell, Yates. I waited until the 1st of March to make my move. The HOA had a regular board meeting scheduled for that evening, the first Monday of every month like clockwork. I knew they'd all be there, Brenda and her cronies, sitting around the table in the clubhouse meeting room like they owned the place. Except they didn't own it anymore. I did. I showed up at 6:30, right when the meeting was supposed to start. There were about a dozen cars in the parking lot, which meant a decent turnout. I walked through the front door carrying a folder full of documents and found exactly what I expected. Brenda was at the head of the table, flanked by the other board members. I recognized Tom Harrison, the vice president, a balding guy in his 50s who ran a dental practice in Anchorage. Next to him was Sharon Winters, the treasurer, a pinch-faced woman who'd once tried to fine me for parking my truck on the street overnight. Rounding out the board were Gary and Linda Mitchell, a married couple who seemed to exist solely to agree with whatever Brenda said. There were also several other homeowners scattered around the room in folding chairs, looking various degrees of bored and annoyed. Dan, my neighbor, was there. He caught my eye and gave me a small wave. Brenda looked up from her papers when I walked in, her expression souring immediately. "Yates, I didn't realize you were planning to attend tonight. Wouldn't miss it," I said cheerfully. "Mind if I say a few words before you get started? We have a very full agenda tonight, so if you could wait until the homeowner comment period at the end." "This can't wait," I interrupted, walking to the front of the room. "See, I have some news that's going to affect everyone here." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "What kind of news?" I opened my folder and pulled out a copy of the property deed. "As of last Friday, I am the owner of this building. Northern Property Holdings transferred the deed to me, and your lease agreement expired on February 28th. Since I have not agreed to renew that lease, you are all currently trespassing on my private property." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Brenda's face went from pale to red in about 2 seconds. "That's impossible. We have a lease." "You had a lease." Past tense. It expired. I held up the deed so everyone could see the official state seal. "I'm the new owner, and I'm here to inform you that you need to vacate the premises immediately." Tom Harrison found his voice first. "You can't do this. We have rights. We're a legally recognized homeowners association. And you're welcome to be an HOA anywhere you want, just not in my building." I turned to address the room. "For everyone who's not on the board, let me be clear. I have no problem with any of you. You're welcome to take any personal belongings you might have here, but the HOA board needs to leave. Now." Sharon Winters stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is outrageous. We'll sue you. We'll file an injunction. You can't just kick us out." "Actually, I can. Check with your lawyer if you don't believe me. The lease expired. I'm the property owner, and I'm exercising my right to deny you access." I pulled out my phone. "I have the non-emergency police number ready to dial if you'd like to do this the hard way." Brenda was shaking with rage. "Why are you doing this? What did we ever do to you?" I had to laugh at that. "What did you do? Let's see. You fined me $500 for warming up my snow machine 15 minutes early. You've harassed me and half the other people in this neighborhood with your ridiculous rules and your power trips. You've turned this community into a place where people are afraid to live their own lives because you might decide they're violating some obscure bylaw in your little book of tyranny. We were maintaining property values and quality of life. You were being petty tyrants, Brenda. And now you're done." I gestured toward the door. "Everyone out. You have 5 minutes to gather your personal items, and then I'm making that phone call." Dan started clapping. Slowly at first, then faster, and within seconds about half the room had joined in. Brenda looked around at the applauding homeowners, her face twisted with fury and humiliation. "You'll regret this," she hissed at me. "I really don't think I will." It took 15 minutes for them to clear out, the board members gathering up papers and files while shooting daggers at me with their eyes. I stood by the door, arms crossed, watching them load boxes into their cars. A few of the other homeowners came up to shake my hand and thank me, including Dan. "That was beautiful, man. he said, grinning. "I've been waiting for someone to stand up to Brenda for years. Happy to be of service." Once everyone was gone, I locked the door and took a walk through my new building. It really was a nice space. The meeting hall was big and open, with good natural light from the tall windows. The gym was small but functional, with a few treadmills, some free weights, and a universal machine. The office where Brenda had reigned was cramped and cluttered, filled with filing cabinets and boxes of HOA records. I spent the next hour going through those records, and what I found was enlightening. The HOA's finances were a mess, with inconsistent bookkeeping and several large expenses that didn't have proper documentation. There were also copies of all the fines they'd issued over the past few years, and I was far from the only victim of their overzealous enforcement. They'd hit dozens of homeowners for everything from trash, cans being visible from the street, to mailbox paint being the wrong shade of black. But what really caught my attention was a folder labeled Legal Matters. Inside were letters from a law firm in Anchorage, correspondence about a lawsuit that had been filed against the HOA 2 years ago by a homeowner who'd been fined repeatedly for having a vegetable garden in his front yard. The HOA had fought the case and lost, and according to the documents, they'd been ordered to pay the homeowner's legal fees plus damages totaling $18,000, except they'd never paid it. The homeowner, a guy named Robert Chen, had obtained a judgment, and the HOA had been ignoring it. That was fraud, pure and simple. I took pictures of every document in the folder with my phone. Over the next few days, I got several angry calls from Brenda and the other board members. They threatened lawsuits, claimed I'd violated some kind of implied contract, even suggested that I'd somehow broken the law by purchasing the building without telling them. I referred them all to my lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Wu, who I'd hired specifically to handle any fallout from my little stunt. Patricia called me 3 days after the eviction. "You're going to love this," she said. "The HOA's lawyer just contacted me. They want to negotiate a new lease." "Absolutely not." That's what I told them. Then they offered to purchase the building from you at market rate. Also no. Figured as much. But here's where it gets interesting. I did some digging into their finances and they're in bad shape. They've been operating at a deficit for the past 18 months, covering expenses by dipping into their reserve fund. Without the clubhouse, they don't have anywhere to hold meetings or store their records. They're basically dead in the water. Good. There's something else. You said you found documents about an unpaid judgment. Yeah, $18,000 to a Robert Chen. I contacted Mr. Chen. He's very interested in pursuing collection. I also found 2 other homeowners who have active complaints against the HOA for selective enforcement of rules. If we can establish a pattern of misconduct, we might be able to get the state to investigate them. I thought about that. Do it. Whatever it takes. Patricia's investigation moved quickly. She contacted every homeowner who'd been fined by the HOA in the past 3 years, which turned out to be more than 60 people. Of those, 23 were willing to provide statements about what they felt was unfair or discriminatory enforcement of the rules. Several patterns emerged. The HOA tended to fine younger homeowners more frequently than older ones. People who'd ever challenged or questioned the board got hit with violations at a much higher rate. And certain addresses, including mine, seemed to be targeted for extra scrutiny. One homeowner, a woman named Jennifer Talbot, told Patricia that Brenda had openly admitted to her that they kept an eye on troublemakers to make sure they stayed in line. Another, Marcus Webb, said that Tom Harrison had told him the board wanted to force out residents who didn't fit the community values, whatever that meant. By the end of March, Patricia had compiled everything into a formal complaint that she filed with the Alaska Attorney General's office. She also helped Robert Chen file a motion to seize HOA assets to satisfy his judgment, which meant freezing their bank accounts. That's when Brenda made her biggest mistake. She showed up at my house at 7 in the evening on a Tuesday, pounding on my door hard enough that I thought she might break it. When I opened it, she tried to force her way inside. "We need to talk right now," she demanded, pushing against the door. I held it steady. "No, we don't. Get off my property, Brenda. You're destroying this community. You understand that? Everything we've built, everything we've worked for, you mean everything you've used to control and harass people." "Yeah, I understand that perfectly." Her face was blotchy with anger, her eyes wild. "I won't let you get away with this. I won't. You need to leave. Now." I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app, hitting record. "I'm documenting this. You're on my property, refusing to leave. That's trespassing. You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you've won." She was shouting now, loud enough that I saw Dan's porch light come on across the street. "I know people. I have connections. I can make your life a living hell. Threatening me now, really?" I kept the camera pointed at her. "Last chance, Brenda. Leave or I call the police." She stood there for another few seconds, breathing hard, then turned and stalked back to her car. She peeled out of my driveway fast enough to leave rubber marks on the street. I sent the video to Patricia immediately. "We might want to consider a restraining order," she said after watching it. "That's clearly threatening behavior. Let's hold off for now, but keep the video. I have a feeling we'll need it." The Attorney General's investigation took about 6 weeks. During that time, the HOA effectively ceased to function. Without access to their clubhouse or their bank accounts, they couldn't hold meetings, collect dues, or enforce any rules. It was glorious. People started parking on the street overnight. A couple of homeowners painted their front doors colors that definitely weren't on the approved list. Someone even put up a basketball hoop, which had been explicitly forbidden. The neighborhood felt lighter, like we'd all been holding our breath for years and could finally exhale. In mid-May, Patricia called with an update. The AG's office finished their investigation. They found evidence of mismanagement of funds, selective enforcement of rules that could constitute harassment, and the whole mess with the unpaid judgment. They're recommending that the HOA be dissolved and that the board members be personally liable for any outstanding debts. Can they do that? Dissolve the HOA in Alaska. If an HOA is found to be operating in a way that's harmful to homeowners or violating state law, yes. It's rare, but it happens. The AG will issue a formal recommendation, and then it goes to a vote of all the homeowners in the development. If a majority vote to dissolve, it's done. And the board members, Brenda, Tom, Sharon, and the Mitchells could all be held personally responsible for the unpaid judgment and any other liabilities. We're talking potentially $50,000 or $60,000 once you factor in legal fees and penalties. I felt a savage satisfaction at that. When's the vote? They're scheduling it for the first week of June. I'll make sure you're notified. The special meeting was held at the Eagle River Community Center, since the HOA no longer had access to their clubhouse. More than 100 homeowners showed up, which was apparently unprecedented. The room was packed, people standing along the walls and sitting in every available chair. A representative from the Attorney General's office, a serious-looking man named David Park, stood at the front and laid out the findings. He was thorough and professional, detailing every instance of financial mismanagement, selective enforcement, and harassment the investigation had uncovered. By the time he finished, Brenda and her board looked like they wanted to sink through the floor. "Based on these findings," David said, The state recommends dissolution of the Glacier Ridge Homeowners Association. This would require a majority vote of all homeowners. If the vote passes, all HOA rules and regulations would be void, and the neighborhood would operate under standard city and county ordinances. Any assets remaining after satisfaction of debts would be distributed proportionally to homeowners based on their time in the community. Brenda stood up, her voice shaking. "I'd like to say something." David nodded. "You have the floor." "This is a witch hunt. We have been serving this community for years, volunteering our time and effort to maintain property values and ensure a high quality of life for everyone. Yes, we've made mistakes. Yes, there have been some issues with how rules were enforced, but that doesn't mean the entire association should be destroyed." She looked around the room, her eyes pleading. "We can fix this. We can elect a new board, revise the rules, do better. Please don't throw away everything we've built." She sat down and the room was quiet for a moment. Then Dan stood up. "I've lived in Glacier Ridge for 8 years, he said. "In that time, I've been fined 7 times for things like having my trash cans visible for more than 2 hours on collection day and parking my truck on the street while my wife's car was in the shop. I've watched the HOA turn this neighborhood into a place where everyone's afraid to step out of line. I vote yes on dissolution." One by one, other homeowners stood up to share their stories. Marcus Webb talked about being targeted after he questioned a fine. Jennifer Talbot described how Brenda had made her feel unwelcome because she was younger than most of the neighborhood. Robert Chen explained how the HOA had ignored a court judgment against them for 2 years. When it came time for the vote, it wasn't even close. Of the 112 homeowners present, 94 voted to dissolve the HOA. 12 voted against. 6 abstained. The Glacier Ridge Homeowners Association was done over the next few months. The details got sorted out. The HOA's remaining assets, which amounted to about $30,000 after Robert Chen's judgment and legal fees were paid, got distributed to homeowners as rebates on the dues they'd paid over the years. Everyone got about $200, which wasn't much but felt like a victory anyway. Brenda and the other board members got hit with personal liability for about $45,000 in total, split among the 5 of them. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Brenda and her husband put their house up for sale in July. They moved to Wasilla, and I can't say anyone was sorry to see them go. As for the clubhouse, I had to figure out what to do with my new property. I briefly considered turning it into a rental space, but the more I thought about it, the more I liked a different idea. I talked to Dan and some of the other neighbors, and we came up with a plan. In August, I officially opened the Glacier Ridge Community Center. Not an HOA clubhouse, just a community space available to any resident of the neighborhood for free. Want to host a birthday party? Book it. Need a space for a garage sale when it's raining? It's yours. Starting a book club or a poker night? Come on in. I kept the gym open and even bought some new equipment. I set up the meeting room with comfortable furniture and a big TV. The old HOA office became a kids' playroom, with toys and games and a reading corner. I hired a part-time manager named Sophie to handle scheduling and basic maintenance, and I covered the costs out of pocket. Yeah, I was losing money on the deal, but I didn't care. It felt right. The grand opening was a Saturday afternoon in late August, and half the neighborhood showed up. People brought food and drinks. Kids ran around playing, and there was this atmosphere of genuine community that I'd never felt before. Dan grilled burgers on the patio I'd added. Jennifer Talbot's kids played tag with Marcus Webb's daughter. Someone set up speakers and started playing music. I stood off to the side, watching it all happen, and felt something I hadn't expected. Pride. Not in sticking it to Brenda, though that had been satisfying, but pride in what came after, in building something positive out of the wreckage of her petty kingdom. Sophie came up beside me, holding a paper plate loaded with potato salad. "This is really great, Yates. You did a good thing here." We did a good thing, all of us. Still, not many people would have bought a building just to evict their HOA, then turned it into a free community space. You're either crazy or a really decent guy. Maybe both, I laughed. Definitely both. As summer turned to fall, life in Glacier Ridge settled into a new normal. Without the HOA breathing down everyone's necks, people relaxed. Lawns were still maintained because most people took pride in their homes. Houses stayed in good repair because that's just what homeowners do. But the fear was gone. The constant worry about getting fined for some minor infraction, the feeling of being watched and judged, all of it evaporated. I rode my Snowmachine whenever I wanted, though I still tried to be considerate about the early morning hours. Not because some rule said I had to, but because Dan had mentioned once that his wife worked night shifts and slept late. Being a good neighbor didn't require an HOA handbook. It just required giving a damn about the people around you. In October, I got a letter from Patricia. Brenda Patterson was suing me personally for what she called intentional interference with contractual relationships and malicious harassment. She was seeking damages of $200,000. I called Patricia immediately. Is she serious with this? Dead serious, apparently. Though her case is garbage. You didn't interfere with any contracts. You simply chose not to renew a lease agreement that had expired. And the harassment claim is ridiculous given the documented evidence of her behavior, including that video of her at your house. So what do? We file a motion to dismiss, which should be granted. And honestly, Yates, I'd consider a countersuit for frivolous litigation and harassment. You have grounds, especially with that video. Do it. The countersuit got Brenda's attention. Her lawyer contacted Patricia within a week, trying to negotiate a settlement where both sides would drop their claims. Patricia told them to pound sand. We went to court in January, almost exactly a year after this whole mess had started. The hearing was in Anchorage, in a courtroom that felt too formal for what was essentially a neighborhood dispute. Brenda was there with her lawyer, a tired-looking guy who had clearly realized his client didn't have a case. I sat with Patricia, feeling weirdly calm. The judge, a woman named Elena Santos, reviewed the filings and listened to both sides present their arguments. Brenda's lawyer tried to make the case that I'd specifically purchased the building to harm the HOA, which constituted tortious interference. Patricia countered with the lease agreement, showing that it had clearly expired and that I had every right as a property owner to decline renewal. She also introduced evidence of Brenda's pattern of harassment, including the video from my doorstep. Judge Santos didn't take long to make her decision. Mr. Olson acted within his legal rights as a property owner. The lease agreement had expired, and he was under no obligation to renew it. Furthermore, the evidence presented suggests that Miss Patterson's behavior toward Mr. Olson included harassment and potentially threatening conduct. The plaintiff's case is dismissed with prejudice. She turned to Brenda. Miss Patterson, I would strongly advise you to accept Mr. Olson's settlement offer in his countersuit. If this proceeds to trial, I suspect you will not like the outcome. Brenda's face went pale. 2 weeks later, we settled. She agreed to pay my legal fees, issue a written apology, and accept a restraining order requiring her to stay at least 500 feet away from me and my property. She also had to perform 100 hours of community service. It was over. Finally, completely, totally over. Spring came to Alaska the way it always does, slowly and then all at once. The snow melted, the days got longer, and green started showing up everywhere. I spent a Saturday in April working in my yard, planting flowers and fixing a section of fence that had been damaged over the winter. No one told me what color the flowers had to be, or where the fence needed to be, or how high the grass could get before I had to mow. Dan came over with a six-pack around dinner time, and we sat on my deck, drinking beer and watching the sun hang in the sky like it was in no hurry to set. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Buying the clubhouse, all the legal stuff, everything that came after." I thought about it. "Not for a second. You spent, what, close to 400 grand buying that building, and now you're operating it at a loss. Money well spent." I took a sip of my beer. "You know what Brenda and that board never understood? Community isn't about rules and enforcement. It's not about keeping everyone in line or punishing people for stepping out of bounds. It's about people looking out for each other, helping when help is needed, and letting everyone live their lives." "That's pretty philosophical for you." "Yeah, well, I've had time to think about it." I gestured toward the community center, visible from my deck. "That building gets used more now than it ever did as an HOA clubhouse. People actually want to go there. Kids have birthday parties there. We had a neighborhood watch meeting there last month that actually felt productive instead of being a forum for complaints. That's worth more than the money I spent." Dan nodded slowly. "You're a better man than me. I would have just told Brenda to screw off and dealt with the fines." "I tried that. Didn't work out so well." I grinned. "Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, or in this case, fight petty tyranny with property ownership." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light change across the mountains. The sound of kids playing drifted over from somewhere in the neighborhood, along with the distant rumble of someone's lawnmower. Normal sounds, life sounds. "So what's next for you?" Dan asked eventually. "Now that your war with the HOA is over?" "I don't know. Maybe I'll take up another hobby, something else Brenda would have hated. Get a rooster. Start a beekeeping operation. Install a water feature that plays loud classical music at all hours." Dan laughed. "You're going to give some future buyer of her old house nightmares. That's just a bonus." The truth was, I hadn't thought much about what came next. I'd been so focused on the fight with the HOA, on standing up to Brenda and her board, that I hadn't looked beyond it. But sitting there on my deck, drinking beer with my neighbor, watching the spring evening settle over Eagle River, I realized I didn't need some grand plan. This was enough. This quiet, ordinary, drama-free life in a neighborhood where people could just be themselves. That summer, we had a neighborhood barbecue at the community center. It was bigger than the grand opening, with probably 200 people showing up. Someone had the idea to make it an annual thing, a way to celebrate the community we'd built together. I found myself manning one of the grills, flipping burgers and hot dogs while Sophie organized games for the kids and Marcus set up a volleyball net. Jennifer Talbot brought her new boyfriend, a nice guy named Chris, who worked as a firefighter in Anchorage. Robert Chen showed up with his family, and he made a point of thanking me again for helping expose the HOA's misconduct. People I didn't know well came up to introduce themselves, to share stories about their own battles with Brenda's board, to express gratitude for what had changed. Late in the evening, as things were winding down and the sun was finally starting to think about setting, I found myself standing near the community center entrance, looking out at all the people scattered across the lawn. Kids chasing each other, adults talking and laughing, couples dancing to music from the speakers. It was chaotic and messy and imperfect, and it was beautiful. Sophie appeared beside me again, her arms full of empty paper plates she was collecting. "You look contemplative." just thinking about how different things are now. Better, different. Definitely better. I took one of the trash bags from her and started helping collect garbage. You know, when I bought this place, all I cared about was getting revenge on Brenda, showing her she couldn't push people around without consequences. And now I'm glad I did it for the right reasons, even if I didn't realize that's what I was doing at the time. I tied off a garbage bag and grabbed another one. Tearing down something bad is satisfying, but building something good in its place is better. Look at you, getting all wise in your old age, I laughed. I'm 34. Ancient. She grinned and headed off to collect more trash, leaving me to my thoughts. The years that followed were good ones. The neighborhood continued to thrive without the HOA's heavy hand. Property values stayed steady, despite Brenda's predictions of chaos and decline. The community center became a genuine hub of activity, hosting everything from yoga classes to craft fairs to emergency shelter during a particularly bad winter storm. I kept riding my snow machine, exploring trails all over the Matsu Valley. No one complained about the noise. Well, not to my face anyway, and if they did have an issue, they talked to me like a normal person instead of sending threatening letters about fines and violations. I dated a woman named Deanna Richards for a while, a teacher from Anchorage who thought the whole HOA story was hilarious. We'd met at a mutual friend's party, and when she asked about the most interesting thing I'd done recently, I told her about buying a building to evict my homeowners association. She'd laughed so hard she'd snorted wine through her nose, and I'd known right then I wanted to see her again. It didn't work out long term. We wanted different things from life. But we stayed friends, and she still came to the neighborhood barbecue every year. Dan and his wife had their first kid, a daughter named Emma who he absolutely doted on. I became the unofficial honorary uncle, the guy who showed up with ridiculous toys and let her make a mess without caring. When Emma was 3, she started calling me Uncle Yates, and something about that made me happier than I expected. Life moved forward the way it does, one day and then the next, stringing together into weeks and months and years. The community center needed repairs sometimes, which I paid for. Sophie eventually left to take a job in Fairbanks, and I hired a retired veteran named Tom Reeves to replace her. Tom ran the place like a well-oiled machine and started a veteran support group that met there twice a month. I got promoted at work, which meant more money and more responsibility. I thought about moving to a bigger house, maybe something in Anchorage proper, but I never seriously considered it. Eagle River was home now. This neighborhood, these people, this community we'd built together, I was part of it in a way I'd never been part of anything before. 5 years after I bought the clubhouse, I ran into Brenda Patterson at a grocery store in Wasilla. I was up there visiting a work site, just stopping in to grab some supplies, and there she was in the produce section, looking older and more tired than I remembered. She saw me at the same time I saw her, and for a moment we just stood there 10 feet apart, holding bags of apples and staring at each other. I couldn't read her expression. Anger, embarrassment, resignation. Finally she spoke. "Yates, Brenda." Another silence. Then quietly, almost too quiet to hear over the store's background music, she said, "I heard the neighborhood is doing well." "It is. And the community center is popular. Very popular." She nodded slowly, looking down at the apples in her hand. "I thought it would fall apart without structure, without rules and enforcement. Turns out people don't need to be controlled to be good neighbors. They just need to not be harassed." That got a reaction, a tiny flinch, but she didn't argue. I was trying to protect property values, to maintain standards. "You were trying to control people, Brenda. There's a difference." She looked up at me then, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been understanding, or might have been regret, or might have just been exhaustion. Maybe you're right. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close. But it was something, an acknowledgement that maybe, possibly, she'd been wrong. I decided that was enough. Take care of yourself, Brenda. You too. I walked away, and I never saw her again. I heard, years later, that she'd moved to Arizona with her husband, looking for somewhere warmer and quieter. I hoped she'd found whatever she was looking for. I hoped she'd learned something from everything that had happened. But mostly, I just stopped thinking about her. The HOA saga became one of those stories that got told at parties and barbecues, passed around the neighborhood like legend. People exaggerated the details, made me out to be braver or more calculated than I'd actually been. I never corrected them. Let them have their hero story, their tale of standing up to petty authority. If it made them feel empowered to push back against their own bureaucratic nightmares, that was good enough for me. 10 years after I bought the Clubhouse, Eagle River continued to grow and change. New families moved in, old families moved out. The neighborhood cycled through generations the way neighborhoods do. But the community center remained constant, a gathering place that belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. I was 44 years old, still single, still working in petroleum engineering, still riding my snow machine every winter. My hair was starting to go gray at the temples, and I needed reading glasses for fine print, but I felt good. I felt settled. I felt like I'd found my place. On a cold November morning, I fired up my snow machine at 6:30, a full 30 minutes before the old HOA noise ordinance would have allowed. The engine roared to life, echoing off the houses around me, and no one came out to yell. No one sent threatening letters. No one cared, because people were reasonable and understood that sometimes a guy wanted to ride early before work. I strapped on my helmet, checked my gear, and headed out toward the trails. The sun was just starting to think about rising, painting the sky in shades of deep blue and purple. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, leaving everything clean and pristine. My machine cut through it easily, throwing up white powder in my wake. I thought about that morning 10 years ago when this had all started, when Brenda had come screaming across the street about noise violations. I thought about the anger I'd felt, the determination to fight back, the satisfaction of winning. But mostly I thought about what came after, about building something better from the ashes of something petty and small. The trail opened up ahead of me, winding through the trees and up into the hills. I throttled up, feeling the cold wind on my face and the power of the machine beneath me. Free. That's what I felt. Free to live my life, to be myself, to exist in my own home without fear of fines or violations or judgment. That freedom had cost me $400,000 and a year of my life fighting legal battles. It had cost me time and energy and stress. But it had been worth every penny, every hour, every gray hair. Because some things are worth fighting for, and being able to live your life on your own terms is definitely one of them. I rode for 2 hours that morning, pushing deep into the backcountry, enjoying the solitude and the snow and the pure simple joy of movement. When I finally headed back home, the sun was fully up, and the neighborhood was coming to life. People heading to work, kids waiting for the school bus, normal everyday life happening all around. I pulled into my driveway, killed the engine, and sat there for a moment, catching my breath. My phone buzzed with a text from Dan. Emma's birthday party at the community center Saturday. You better be there, Uncle Yates. I smiled and typed back. Wouldn't miss it. That's what it all came down to, really. Not revenge against an HOA board. Not some grand statement about freedom and authority. Just this. A community where people could live and laugh and celebrate together without someone looking over their shoulder, waiting to write them up for violations. A place where a guy could be an honorary uncle, where neighbors could be friends, where a building could be shared instead of controlled. I climbed off my snow machine, pulled off my helmet, and headed inside to get ready for work. It was going to be a good day. They usually were now. Funny how removing one toxic element could change everything. How standing up to petty tyranny could ripple out into something bigger and better than I'd ever imagined. The Glacier Ridge Community Center still stands today, still open to everyone, still free. I still own it, and I still run it at a loss, and I still don't care about the money. Some investments pay dividends that can't be measured in dollars. They pay in birthday parties and yoga classes and veteran support groups. They pay in neighbors who wave instead of glare, in kids who play without fear, in a community that actually functions like a community. And on cold winter mornings, when I fire up my snow machine and head out to the trails, no one complains about the noise. No one sends threatening letters. No one tries to fine me for living my life. That, more than anything else, is what makes it all worthwhile. That simple freedom to exist, to pursue happiness, to be myself in my own home. Brenda Patterson wanted to create order through control. What she actually created was resentment, fear, and a community that was dying under the weight of her rules. What I created, accidentally at first and then intentionally, was space. Space for people to be themselves, to make mistakes, to live messily and imperfectly and authentically. Looking back now, from the comfortable distance of a decade, I can see that buying that clubhouse was the best decision I ever made. Not because of the revenge, sweet as that was, but because of what came after. Because I learned that sometimes the best way to fight authority isn't to rage against it, but to simply remove its power and build something better in its place. The story could end there, neat and tidy, with lessons learned and a community thriving. But life doesn't really work that way. There's no neat ending, no final chapter where everything wraps up perfectly. There's just the next day, and the day after that, and all the days that follow. Emma turned 7 on that Saturday, and we threw her a party at the community center that would have given Brenda Patterson a heart attack. Kids running everywhere, decorations taped haphazardly to the walls, pizza and cake and enough sugar to fuel a small army. It was chaos. It was loud. It was messy. It was perfect. I helped Dan set up the bounce house they'd rented, and we stood back watching Emma and her friends jump and scream with pure joy. His wife, Sarah, came over with plates of cake for us. "Thanks for everything," she said, gesturing around the room. "For this place, for being part of Emma's life. It means a lot. She's a great kid. You guys did good." Dan put his arm around Sarah and grinned at me. "Remember when you first told me you were going to buy the HOA's building? I thought you'd lost your mind." "I might have. Best crazy decision ever." We stood there watching the party, 3 adults eating cake and feeling grateful for the simple gift of community. That's what it came down to in the end. Not grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but these small moments of connection and celebration. The boring, beautiful business of living alongside other people without anyone trying to control anyone else. The next morning, Sunday, I woke up early and went for a run through the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, the air crisp with approaching winter. I passed houses where people were just waking up, lights coming on in kitchens, the smell of coffee drifting from open windows. Normal Sunday morning, nothing special, everything special. When I got back home, I made breakfast and sat on my deck despite the cold, wrapped in a heavy jacket and watching the mountains in the distance. My phone rang. Patricia Wu, my lawyer. We'd stayed in touch over the years and she'd become a friend. Morning, Yates. Got some interesting news for you. Yeah, remember Sharon Winters, HOA treasurer, unfortunately. She's facing criminal charges, embezzlement. Turns out she was skimming from the HOA funds for years. The AG's investigation started it, but the new forensic accountant they brought in found evidence that goes back almost a decade. She could be looking at serious prison time. I absorbed that. How much did she steal? Over $150,000. I whistled low. And Brenda never noticed. Either she didn't notice or she was complicit. The investigation is ongoing. Patricia paused. They might want to talk to you again, given your history with the HOA, whatever they need. We talked for a few more minutes about the legal details, then hung up. I sat there thinking about Sharon Winters, about how the pursuit of control and power over a neighborhood HOA had led to actual crimes, actual victims. How many of those ridiculous fines and fees had been driven by Sharon's need to keep stealing money to cover her tracks. The news about Sharon spread through the neighborhood quickly. People were shocked, angry, vindicated. She'd been one of the ones pushing hardest for strict enforcement, for constant fines, for ever-increasing HOA dues. Now everyone knew why. Sharon Winters was arrested in December. The local news covered it, a brief segment about HOA corruption that mentioned the Glacier Ridge situation. My name came up as the homeowner who'd helped expose the misconduct. I declined interview requests. This wasn't about me being a hero. This was about justice for all the people who'd been fined and harassed to cover up Sharon's crimes. The trial happened the following spring. Patricia kept me updated, though I wasn't called to testify. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, forged documents, testimony from forensic accountants. Sharon had been stealing from the HOA for 9 years, taking money that should have gone to neighborhood improvements and maintenance and depositing it into personal accounts. She was convicted on multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to all the homeowners she'd stolen from. Since the HOA had been dissolved, the restitution got distributed directly to residents based on how long they'd lived there and how much they'd paid in dues. I got a check for $4,000. I donated it all to the Eagle River Food Bank. The Sharon Winters situation became the final chapter in the Glacier Ridge HOA saga. It validated everything we'd fought for, proved that the board had been corrupt from the top down. People who defended Brenda and her crew, who'd claimed we were overreacting or causing trouble, went quiet. The evidence was undeniable. Life continued to move forward. Seasons changed. People came and went. The community center kept humming along, serving as the heart of our neighborhood. I kept working, kept riding my Snowmachine, kept being Uncle Yates to Emma and a few other neighborhood kids. 14 years after I bought the Clubhouse, I got an offer I hadn't expected. A development company wanted to buy the community center property. They were planning to build a new mixed-use complex in the area and wanted to assemble a larger parcel of land. They offered me $800,000, nearly double what I'd paid for it. I sat with the offer for a week, thinking about it from every angle. The money would be nice, sure. I could retire early, travel, do whatever I wanted. But the community center had become more than just a building I owned. It was a symbol of what we'd built together, proof that community could exist without authoritarian control. I called the development company and declined their offer. They came back with $900,000. I declined again. They tried one more time at $1 million flat, and I told them the property wasn't for sale at any price. Then I did something that surprised even me. I talked to a lawyer about setting up a trust that would own the community center in perpetuity. with clear guidelines that it had to remain a free community space for Eagle River residents forever. I transferred ownership from myself personally to the trust, with a board of local residents to oversee it. Dan was one of the board members. So was Jennifer Talbot, Marcus Webb, Robert Chen, Tom Reeves. People who understood what the space meant, who'd been there when we dismantled the HOA and built something better. The transfer was finalized on a Tuesday in June. No ceremony, no big announcement. Just paperwork and signatures, and the satisfaction of knowing that the community center would outlast all of us, would continue to serve the neighborhood long after I was gone. That night, I went to the center for the weekly veteran support group that Tom Reeves ran. I wasn't a veteran, but Tom had invited me to sit in sometimes, to hear their stories and perspectives. There were about 15 guys there, ranging from a Vietnam vet in his 70s to a kid who'd just gotten back from deployment in the Middle East. They talked about the challenges of readjusting to civilian life, about PTSD and medical issues and family struggles. They supported each other, offered advice, just listened when listening was what was needed. It was raw and real and important, and it was happening because this space existed for them. After the meeting ended and everyone else had left, Tom came over to where I was stacking chairs. Heard about what you did, transferring the property to a trust. News travels fast. Small neighborhood. He grabbed another stack of chairs. That was a good thing you did. Ensuring this place can't be sold or developed. Felt like the right move. You know, when I first moved here, I was skeptical about community centers and all that cumbaya stuff. But this place, what happens here, it matters. You created something real. We created it, all of us. Tom nodded slowly. Fair enough. But you started it. You fought the fight that needed fighting, and you didn't stop with just tearing down something bad. You built something good. That takes character. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just kept stacking chairs. But his words stayed with me, rattling around in my head for days after. The summer I turned 50. Eagle River threw a community celebration that had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with what we'd built together. 20 years had passed since I'd bought the clubhouse and evicted the HOA, and the neighborhood had thrived in ways that would have seemed impossible back then. The celebration was at the community center, naturally. Hundreds of people showed up, including folks who'd moved to the neighborhood long after the HOA had been dissolved. They'd heard the stories, the legend of how one guy had bought a building to evict his homeowners association, but they didn't really understand what it had meant to live under Brenda Patterson's rule. Emma, Dan's daughter, was 17 now, getting ready for her senior year of high school. She'd grown up with the community center as her second home, had celebrated every birthday there, had learned to play basketball in the gym and made 1,000 memories in that building. She found me near the food tables, looking like a young adult instead of the little kid who used to call me Uncle Yates. "Hey," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "My history teacher wants us to do a project on local civic engagement." I was thinking about doing mine on the whole HOA thing, how you guys fought back and created this place. Would you be willing to be interviewed? I smiled. Your generation doesn't even remember having an HOA. Exactly. That's why the story matters. You changed things so much that we can't even imagine how it used to be. That hit me harder than I expected. She was right. The kids growing up in Glacier Ridge now had no concept of living under constant surveillance and threat of fines. They took for granted that they could play in their yards, park on the street, paint their mailboxes whatever color they wanted. Freedoms we'd had to fight for were just normal life to them. "Yeah," I said, "I'll do the interview." Over the following weeks, Emma interviewed me, Dan, Patricia Wu, several other homeowners who'd been there during the HOA days. She dug through old records and documents, pieced together the timeline, created this comprehensive history of the whole saga. Her final project was a 30-minute documentary that played at a school assembly, and later got picked up by a local news station. Watching it, I barely recognized the angry guy I'd been 20 years ago, standing in my driveway at 6:45 in the morning, getting screamed at by Brenda Patterson for warming up my snow machine. That person seemed young and naive, even though he'd been in his 30s. He'd had no idea what he was starting, no concept of where it would lead, but that's how these things work. You don't set out to change a community or start a movement. You just get pushed too far one time and you push back, and then suddenly you're in the middle of something bigger than you ever imagined. The years continue to roll by as they do. I retired from petroleum engineering at 55, though I stayed in the area. My hair went fully gray. I needed more than just reading glasses. My knees complained when I went snow machining, though I still went as often as I could. Dan's Emma graduated from college and got a job in community organizing in Seattle. She credited that history project, that deep dive into how ordinary people could fight back against petty authority, with inspiring her career path. Dan loved to tell me that, to remind me that the ripples from buying a building 25 years ago were still spreading outward. The community center remained the heart of Glacier Ridge. New programs started there. A neighborhood food co-op, art classes for seniors, tutoring for struggling students. Every need that emerged, the center somehow found a way to address. Not through top-down mandates or strict rules, but through people coming together and figuring out solutions. That's what Brenda and her board had never understood. Community isn't created through control. It's created through connection, through people choosing to care about each other and work together. The HOA had tried to force community through regulations, and all they'd created was resentment. We'd let community grow organically, and it had flourished beyond anything I could have imagined. On a cold morning in January, 30 years after this all began, I fired up my snow machine one last time. I was 64 years old, and my doctor had been making noises about how I needed to slow down, take it easier. But I wasn't ready to give up my rides just yet. The machine roared to life, loud as ever. I strapped on my helmet, feeling the familiar weight of it, the comfortable ritual of preparing for a ride. The neighborhood around me was still asleep, the sky just starting to lighten. Perfect conditions. I headed out toward the trails, cutting through fresh snow, feeling alive in a way that nothing else made me feel. The cold air, the speed, the solitude of the backcountry. This was why I'd fought so hard all those years ago, not just for the principle of the thing, but for this. For the freedom to live my life on my own terms, to pursue my passions without someone constantly telling me no. I rode for an hour, maybe more, lost track of time. When I finally turned back toward home, the sun was fully up and I felt good, tired but satisfied, ready for whatever came next. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw Dan standing on his porch across the street, coffee mug in hand. He waved. I waved back. 30 years of being neighbors, of being friends. 30 years of living in a community that actually felt like a community. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, just breathing. My phone buzzed with a message. The community center needed some roof repairs. Could I approve the budget? I typed back a quick yes. The trust covered the costs, but they still ran things by me out of courtesy. Another message came in. Jennifer Talbot's granddaughter was having a birthday party at the center next weekend. Was I coming? Of course I was coming. I'd watched Jennifer's kids grow up, and now I was watching her grandkids. The circle of life, playing out in this neighborhood that had somehow become more home than anywhere else I'd ever lived. I climbed off my snow machine and headed inside, peeling off layers of cold weather gear. The house was quiet, just me and my thoughts. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the neighborhood as it came to life. People heading to work, kids waiting for school buses, the ordinary rhythms of a Wednesday morning. 30 years ago, I'd been so angry. Angry at Brenda, angry at the HOA, angry at the constant petty harassment. That anger had driven me to do something dramatic, to buy a building just to evict my tormentors. But anger alone wouldn't have been enough. What had sustained me, what had made it all worthwhile, was the vision of something better. The hope that we could build a community based on respect and freedom rather than control and fear. And we had. Against the odds, despite the obstacles, we'd done it. Not perfectly, because nothing human is ever perfect, but genuinely, meaningfully in ways that mattered. My phone rang. Patricia Wu, still my lawyer even though she was pushing 70 herself. "Morning, Yates, just calling to check in." "I'm good, everything's good. You sound contemplative." "Just thinking about how far we've come. 30 years since I bought the Clubhouse. Best money you ever spent. No argument there. We talked for a while about nothing important, just the comfortable conversation of old friends. When we hung up, I went back to my window, watching Eagle River wake up to another day. Brenda Patterson had been dead for 5 years. I'd heard about it through the neighborhood grapevine, a brief mention that she'd passed away in Arizona from cancer. I'd felt something when I heard the news, though I couldn't quite name it. Not satisfaction, because I'd never wanted her to suffer. Not sadness, because we'd never been friends. Maybe just closure. The final ending to a chapter that had defined so much of my adult life. Sharon Winters had gotten out of prison after serving 3 years. Last I heard, she was living in Juneau, working in retail and trying to rebuild her life. The other board members had scattered to various corners of the state and beyond. The Glacier Ridge HOA existed now only in stories and memories, a cautionary tale about what happens when small-minded people get a little power. But what we'd built in its place, that was the real story. That was the legacy that mattered. Not the fight, not the revenge, but the community that had grown from the ashes of that petty tyranny. I finished my coffee and got ready to head out for the day. Had some errands to run, a dentist appointment, the mundane tasks of ordinary life. But first, I did something I'd started doing every morning for the past few years. I walked over to the community center just to check on things, to make sure everything was running smoothly. Tom Reeves was there, of course, setting up for a morning yoga class. He nodded when I came in and we exchanged a few words about the roof repairs. Everything was handled. Everything was fine. I did a quick walk through the building, not because I didn't trust Tom, but because I liked to see it. Liked to remember what this space had been and what it had become. The old HOA office, where Brenda had presided over her kingdom of complaints, was now a bright playroom where toddlers learned and grew. The meeting hall, where board members had plotted new ways to fine and harass homeowners, was now a space for celebrations and gatherings. The gym, where I'd once had that confrontation with Brenda and her board, was now a place where people of all ages came to improve their health and well-being. Every inch of the building had been transformed from a symbol of control into a tool for community. That transformation was the real victory, the thing I was most proud of. I left the center and drove into Anchorage for my appointments, my mind wandering as I navigated the familiar roads. 30 years. More than half my adult life defined by this one decision, this one act of defiant property purchase. It had shaped everything that came after, had determined the kind of person I'd become. I'd started as an angry guy who just wanted to ride his snow machine in peace. I'd ended up as someone who'd learned that fighting for your own freedom means fighting for everyone's freedom, and that true community can't be mandated or controlled, only nurtured and protected. The dentist appointment was routine. The errands got done. I grabbed lunch at a little place in Anchorage, sitting alone at the counter and watching people come and go. By mid-afternoon, I was headed back to Eagle River, back to the neighborhood that had become more than just a place I lived. That evening, there was a book club meeting at the community center. I wasn't part of the book club, but I'd gotten in the habit of stopping by various events just to be present, to remind myself why all of this mattered. I sat in the back while a dozen people discussed some mystery novel I hadn't read, and I felt content. This was what victory looked like. Not dramatic confrontations or legal battles, though those had been necessary. Real victory looked like ordinary people gathering on a Tuesday evening to talk about books, free from harassment or judgment, able to simply exist and connect. When the meeting ended, I helped stack chairs, made small talk with a few people, then headed home. The walk from the community center to my house was less than half a mile, and I took my time, enjoying the cool evening air. My house was dark and empty when I got there, but it didn't feel lonely. I'd lived alone for most of my adult life, and I'd made peace with it. Some people needed partners and families to feel complete. I'd found my completeness in community, in being part of something larger than myself. I made dinner, watched some TV, went through the ordinary routines of ordinary life. And as I got ready for bed that night, 30 years after buying a building to evict my HOA, I felt satisfied. Not because I'd won some great battle, though I had, but because I'd helped create something that would outlast me, something that mattered. The Glacier Ridge Community Center would still be there long after I was gone. The trust I'd established would ensure that. Future generations would gather there, create memories there, build their own version of community there. And maybe, if they were lucky, they'd never have to fight the kind of fight I'd fought. Maybe they'd just get to enjoy the freedom that came from people choosing connection over control. That was enough. That was everything. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about that morning 30 years ago, about Brenda Patterson screaming at me in her pink bathrobe, about the anger and frustration I'd felt. If I could go back and tell that younger version of myself what was coming, what would I say? Probably just this: buy the building, fight the fight, build something better, and don't stop until it's done. The story of how I bought an HOA's clubhouse and evicted them became legend in Eagle River, passed down through generations of homeowners, embellished and exaggerated until it barely resembled reality. But the core truth remained. One person, pushed too far by petty tyranny, had pushed back. And in pushing back, had sparked something bigger than himself. That was the real lesson. Not that revenge was sweet, though it was. Not that property ownership was power, though it could be. But that ordinary people, when they've had enough, can change their worlds. They can tear down systems that don't serve them and build new ones that do. It's hard work, it's expensive, and it takes time. But it's possible. I'd proven that. We'd all proven that together. And 30 years later, living in a neighborhood where community thrived without authoritarian control, I knew it had been worth every penny, every hour, every fight. The snow machine sat in my garage, waiting for the next ride. The community center stood at the heart of Glacier Ridge, serving its purpose. And I lived my life in peace, free from fines and violations and the constant threat of petty harassment. Sometimes, Buying a building to evict your HOA is exactly the right thing to do. And sometimes, what starts as revenge becomes something better, something that lifts up an entire community and changes the trajectory of hundreds of lives. That was my story. That was our story, and it was a good one.